when you start doing these vlogs, nobody actually tells you how difficult it might be sometimes to articulate your thoughts in a concise way, and this is my struggle at the moment. Even though as a reader I've experienced reading and thinking about the books that I'm reading and the topics that are presented inside these novels or non-fiction, and sometimes I discuss these things with some of my friends or my partner, articulating in precise manner everything that I want to convey in like a short amount of time. It's proving to be very difficult for me. And today is that day. Today I'm struggling in particular to talk about this book that I chose for this vlog. And I'm not sure why that is, because I've read about these topics before. And I've read fiction, non-fiction, fiction that explores these subjects, and non-fiction that like dives deep into the history and socio-political context of these topics for different countries and different contexts, different historical periods. But for some strange reason, I'm really struggling to articulate my thoughts on this book. But I will try nonetheless one more time. And I really hope this is going to be it. The book in question is False Calm by María, Sonia, Cristoff and Kathrine Silver. And what does this book explore? It explores several topics. History of colonization or colonialism in Argentina, loss of community, the devastating effects that neoliberalism has had on this particular town, the loss of community because of these economic policies, and in general, or not in general, but most importantly, the position that the author as a researcher has in this community. That is, she is examining how the community at first is welcoming and how this welcoming attitude of the community changes over time. And for me, this is very important because as someone who is going to be conducting an ethnographic research for my PhD, I will immerse myself in a community that I will be researching, and because of the way this research is conducted, I need to also understand myself and my position, and not just as a researcher but also as a participant. And what is my understanding? What's my position? Where do I come from? What kind of knowledge do I have? What kind of preconceived notions I have? Prejudice. How do I see the world? How do my moral values, whether they are in line with the values of the community, and how can this affect the research? So she's actually examining all of this in one chapter, and I find that really important. Another very important topic is the history of colonialism and discrimination in Argentina. It's something that I haven't been exposed to very much, and because of that, my understanding and knowledge of Argentina is being challenged. The so far knowledge that I've had of Argentina is being challenged, and I think that's a good thing. The books that we read are not supposed to keep us in this comfort zone. They're supposed to challenge us in our understanding, in view of the world, or whatever topic that they are covering. So far this book, I feel like it's really teaching me many things, and I'm really curious to see how this is developed further on. So I'll just keep you posted about that, and hopefully maybe these videos will inspire you to pick it up and read it if you haven't. But if you have, I would also appreciate to hear your thoughts on the book. Today I'm coming to you from the kitchen. I finished False Calm. I really enjoyed it, and I think I learned a lot. What did I like particularly about this book is that the author is experimenting with the form that she is using while writing. Not every chapter is written in the same way. It has some chapters are focused on one particular story, while others explore several stories, and they are in a way interconnected. The author also presents this mosaic of the people who live in Patagonia. It's not focused only on one particular city, but several cities that have experienced this boom during oil boom, and then slowly went down once the oil they stopped extracting oil. There was nothing more to extract. How the cities have transformed themselves and how they changed over time. The author also addresses all the demographic of the population. So she talks about different ethnicities, migration stories that talk about migrants who migrated from other parts of the world to Argentina, and migrants from other parts of Argentina who migrated to Patagonia for looking for work or just kind of escaping their own life. She also addresses different demographic regarding age of the population and the problems that each generation is facing. So she's addressing the youth, the problem that the youth are facing in these towns, the elderly that are facing mostly in the rural areas around towns, the middle-aged people as well, who have lived in the period when there was enough economic wealth for them to sustain themselves well enough, and then how the disappearance of this economic wealth affected their lives, how they were raising their children, what they could afford, what they couldn't afford. Other things that are really interesting is that she addresses some things that are not much spoken of in the other books that I read coming from Argentina. I haven't read that many, but she talks a lot about xenophobia, racism, as particularly directed towards indigenous population in the region. And it's interesting how she talks about the communities who are discriminated against, how they actually fall into this trap of also racially discriminating against another marginalized community. So I'll just read what she says. In his book, Departures Without Return, Arabs in Patagonia, Elias Zuker recounts the incident in Lagunitas through the direct testimonies that appear in the case file. The book is one of the many that Zuker has written about the region of Patagonia. He has one central hypothesis, as well as several peripheral ones. The traveling salesmen of Arabic origin were massacred by a gang of indigenous people who were mostly Chileans and even constituted something like a Chilean invasion. The same was said by several newspapers at the time, but it occurs to me that the hypothesis of a conflict between nation states seems forced when one considers how evanescent the idea of belonging to a nation, Chile or Argentina, would have been for a group of people who were in large part of Mapuche origin and who, after the military campaigns waged by both Argentina and Chile to annex those territories, just 3 decades earlier, did not feel any belonging to either. They were rather pariah of the borderlands. Moreover, though perhaps the leader of the gang was Chilean and they were effectively based in Chile, everything leads one to believe that they were less inspired by geopolitics than by ambition for illicit wealth. To pursue this goal, they were perfectly positioned. He was an official near a border where the authorities, supposedly in charge of enforcing the law, customs agents and police forces, were scarce, or definitively absent. Might Zuker's hypothesis be part of one of those chain reactions that always occurs among the xenophobes of this world, whereby a group discriminated against by others defends itself by discriminating against a third, and thereby successively? Even at the risk of psychologizing, I ask Zuker if his emphasis on the Chilean origin of the crimes is not his response as a descendant of Arabs to the xenophobia that Patagonia has exhibited towards his people. And this is just one example. She really dives deep into these stories. The structure of the book is such that some stories have been given a full chapter while others are told in these smaller parts, and they're all interconnected. And even though at times it seems like there is no connection because these people have never met or they live even in different towns, they are all interconnected because they are affected by the same socio-political changes that are affecting the region. And I really highly recommend it. Although I would want to say that if you are someone there, I will just give trigger warnings. She writes a lot about economic destitute. There is suicide, rape, abuse, domestic abuse. Am I missing something else? Yeah, she talks about mental health as well, but this last chapter is dedicated to one character, one woman who is suffering. She has been diagnosed, she doesn't say with what exactly, but she was put in a mental hospital, and she talks about a lot of these conspiracy theories and how her life was how she actually knows the truth and she's trying to protect the people while she's being ostracized. Any other disclaimers?
Ciao.
I'm back with the update. I actually recorded myself now, and it was too long. It was 30 minutes. I was speaking for 30 minutes really fast, and I still didn't manage to cover most of the things that I wanted from this book. But I will shorten this now. I don't think I should speak for 30 minutes about this book. But let us begin. So, the life and death of a minke whale in the Amazon. The life and death of a minke whale is actually just one topic that he explores. He explores different communities, different indigenous communities, and also other communities in Brazil that are non-indigenous. He explores the devastation of the ecosystem for the sake of production of monocultures, plant monocultures like soy and rice. And of course, logging industry, cattle industry, and how this is all connected to the destruction of the forest and the traditional way of life for indigenous community, the push of the indigenous community to urban areas and enforced urbanization and enforced lifestyle that just simply does not suit them. In that context, he also explores different political structures, that is, different political periods in Brazil, which have affected the lives of the indigenous communities, and how no matter what kind of political party is in power, they are going to be bringing some kind of form, some kind of legislation, passing legislation, or enforcing certain infrastructural developments that contribute to the exploitation of the indigenous land. So the monocultures that he explores are soy and rice, and in particular he addresses the subject of how soy is affecting, how the treatment and growing of soy affects water supply and the ecosystem overall, because soy requires chemical treatment, like intense chemical treatment, how these chemicals affect the human population and the animal population. It also destroys the plant biodiversity. When it comes to rice, he talks about how rice actually requires a lot of water, and in this one region where they're growing rice, this is actually bringing devastation to the lake and the surrounding rivers. Other things he addresses is racism, historical racism directed towards the indigenous population. There is one whole chapter that is dedicated just to medical racism and how one Christian denomination forced the indigenous population to assimilate into this European Christian thinking and medicinal treatment. He also talks about this one community. He defines it here in the back, which is actually not indigenous, but it's called Quilombo. I think that's how it's pronounced. I've looked it up online, but I still am not sure. If I made a mistake, please correct me. So he says, a Quilombo is a term traditionally describing a group of enslaved people who escaped and formed a community, as well as their descendants. A more contemporary interpretation would define Quilombolas as self-defined ethnic racial group with their own historical backgrounds and documented black ancestry related to the historic fight against racism. This community, because they are not the legislation that they have in Brazil that protects certain indigenous territories, does not protect the territory where the Quilombola live, and this enables the exploitation of their land for various purposes. And they have been struggling to get their land protected and just their the uniqueness of their culture acknowledged in Brazilian legislature. He also speaks about the migrant crisis that happened several years ago when there was a huge influx of migrants from Venezuela to Brazil, and how there was a conflict between the indigenous population in that state of Brazil and the migrants from Venezuela. In particular, I will address this, it's page 55-56. He says here, in Brazil, depending on how it's used, the Spanish term criollo, meaning Creole, can have negative connotations. In Venezuela, however, it's simply the way the non-indigenous population understands itself as Venezuelan, a mixed population of indigenous, African, and European descent. The theory of misgeneration of being Creole is one supported by the Venezuelan elite as a foundation of their national identity, of how people become Venezuelan. In a way, this tension is being reproduced on Brazilian soil in a tiny space next to the Manaus bus terminal, which some 300 people now call home. The clash between indigenous and non-indigenous people that took place that afternoon harkens back to a conflict over land that eventually formed the nation of Venezuela itself, along with so many other Latin American countries. When speaking of colonization and exploitation of the indigenous land, he is only going as far back as I think the beginning of the 20th century, but he in particular is referencing the fascist regime in the 70s and contemporary political situation in Brazil. He doesn't go further than that. And I would like to address one important thing why I think this book is important. One important thing why I think this book is important. Well, that's a nice sentence. He says here, the expansion of soy production in the Amazon can be seen as a transformational process for the relationship between people and plants. It's about transforming the multiplicity of species in a rainforest environment into monochrome, single crop fields. It's not a natural change, it's a socio-political one. A long process that involves economic agents such as large farmers, local politicians, illegal actions like buying land from traditional communities and protected areas, and of course fire. With the onset of the dry season and the resulting drop in rainfall, the use of the fire becomes the most basic means of destroying the forest. Here and in the rest of the book, he explores this interconnectedness. Once you destroy one part, you affect the whole ecosystem. And for me, this is incredibly important because when we talk about climate crisis and protection of certain ecosystems, it's often placed in this discourse of Anthropocenic discourse, that is, that the humans are actually destroying it, when in fact we've seen humans have actually lived with nature. But when we talk about the indigenous communities, they use the nature provides for them, and that's what in the interviews these indigenous people say also. The nature provides for us and we take care of it as well. It takes care of us and we take care of it. If we don't take care of it, we know that we won't be able to survive. And in that context, I will suggest if you are able to check this book out, because it's challenging. Jason W. Moore challenges this concept of Anthropocene, and he's creating a new concept that is Capitalocene, which is basically saying, no, humans are not doing this. There is no like this innate nature, human nature for destruction, but it is actually embedded in the system that we live under, and that is capitalism. And we actually see this when he talks about rice growing and soy growing, how despicableness of the system works. He interviewed this one farmer, which I find it so interesting. He had his small farm and he had like fruits and all kinds of different kind of fruits, and he was saying that when he had his small farm, he would have wild monkeys and all kinds of birds come to feed on different kind of berries. But with the proliferation of soya, this has disappeared because the animals don't come anymore, because they cannot feed on the fruit that is contaminated from the chemicals that are used for treatment of soy. And he was also one of the farmers who had to sell his land because at one point he was just circled by soya fields. And this guy who bought this land around his small farm was day in, day out using different kind of chemicals to treat the soya. And his wife, because of that, because the exposure to the chemicals, his wife ended up dying from cancer. And we see this, like he interviews also school teachers, and the school is located between these soya fields, and the children, because they're curious, they want to see what's going on, they're unknowingly exposed to the chemicals when they are treating the plant, and they are doing it like throughout the day. There is like no time of the day where you can actually escape this, and it's everywhere in the town. And we see this, how this systemic takeover, the settlement of the land is taking place, and it's really detailed. So I think in that context, reading this book is important to understand how the system functions and how it is making it difficult for people, even those who resist, because this farmer he was interviewing, he was resisting for as long as he could. And then at one point he sold his land and he bought new land where he was able to grow this organic fruit on the outskirts of the town. But then the fields just expanded, and you see like the nature of capitalism, how it's like it's expanding, it needs to expand, and nothing there's until it's always looking for new ways to expand. So that's one book that I think it's important to understand these processes that Zuker talks about. I would also like to read one part in the last chapter where he talks about the erasure of medicinal knowledge and of the indigenous population in this one part of Brazil. Okay, he says, traditionally, there are 3 types of expert practitioners among the Tucano and a few other indigenous groups in the Upper Rio Negro, who all work together to treat the body. The Yai is the one with the ability to diagnose diseases. The Kumu is responsible for caring for the patient after they have been diagnosed by the Yai through Baxese and the use of medicinal plants. The Baya is an expert who leads to great ceremonies and is also responsible for the shamanic rituals. According to indigenous beliefs, the dialogue between the experts and the invisible beings is what sustains the forces of the cosmos and maintains the environmental balance in the rainforest. And then he talks about the history of these missionaries, how they came in this region and how they forced the indigenous population to assimilate to their ways, basically. He says, in a way, the colonial focus shifted from controlling the body in order to generate a workforce to controlling the soul in order to generate believers. Targeted in the name of reclaiming the poor savages, the exact language used in the 1970 Celestian Bulletin, the Kamua responsible for the formation of indigenous bodies began to be prosecuted. He's interviewing a man called João Paulo, who says, "Our experts were compared to witches, our knowledge was categorized as profane, we were demonized and prosecuted." Zuker continues, according to the indigenous anthropologists, the Kamua and Baya have become scarce while the Yai have now all but disappeared. The communal longhouses were destroyed and replaced with homes designed for single families. Salesian Catholics believed the longhouses were sites of incestuous orgies and considered the ceremonies and healing rituals to be satanic. They ignored marriage traditions such as the one indicating Tucano men should marry Tuyuca women and gain knowledge about Paxese and medicinal plants from their in-laws. And we see this practice actually was brought from Europe to the colonies. Some of you have maybe read Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. She talks about that, how women were prosecuted beginning in the 14th century and they were pushed out of practicing medicine. And this we see here in this example how those practices from Europe were transferred to the colonies in Latin America. So I will conclude the vlog with just a few remarks. First one is that I was reading in parallel Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire, and I highly recommend this book. It's really short. The part which was written by Aimé Césaire, I think it's maybe like 50 or 70 pages. And the introduction, written by Joan Pinkham, I think, is very important for the context of understanding Césaire's discourse on colonialism. But I would also mention that although at times it was difficult to understand what he was criticizing because it's heavily focused on the time when it was written, he's basically criticizing this intellectualism in French culture and how intellectuals were a very important part of creating intellectual works which were justifying colonialism and imperialism. But because some of the authors I'm familiar with, others I've never heard of, at times it was a little bit difficult to connect because I've never read their work. I don't really know what they were writing about, what kind of role they had in French society, how famous or not famous at the time they were. So on that level it was a little bit difficult to connect, but at the same time he does quote some of these authors directly. And then you can see this discourse that was created in the French intellectual circles. And I think at the same time, this book also helped me kind of think more broadly about the colonization in the Latin America. And especially when it comes to this book. So I feel like it was a good decision on my part to read it in parallel. And a final thought that I will give is the comparison between False Calm and the life and death of the minke whale is that I kind of connected more to this style of writing as it was a mix between journalistic and academic writing, while this one reads more like a fiction at the same time. It is a non-fiction, but the way, the style of writing, the way she chose to focus most of the time on one story for one chapter, it kind of gives also this feeling that it's like a fictional story writing. At least that's my personal take on it. But yeah, so those are the thoughts, last thoughts on these two books. And finally, I will just mention briefly the 3 books I will be reading for the next vlog. I will be coming back now, I will be jumping back to this region. All of the authors are in some way connected to the Balkans, and especially to the history of Yugoslavia. And one of the authors that I will be reading, he is Igor Štiks, and he hasn't been translated to English. He was also my professor here at university, and he was teaching the history of globalization. His other academic work has been written in English, but his novels, I don't think they have been translated. At least this one hasn't. And then the second novel that I will be reading, it's by this author from Chile, Andrea Jeftanovic, Theater of War. And she was born and raised in Chile, but if I'm not mistaken, her parents come from, I think, Croatia. So both of these books talk about migration and generational trauma because of war. And the third book is Bola by Pajtim Statovci. He is a Kosovo-Albanian author, but he writes in Finnish. His family migrated to Finland, and I'm not sure whether he was born in Finland or whether he grew up, like they migrated when he was, I don't know how old he was. But this particular novel is set partly in Kosovo, and I'm not sure where one of the main characters, he actually migrates at one point outside of Kosovo. But it's also an LGBTQI plus novel. It's exploring the trauma of war and homophobia, I think, and just migration and this inability to feel like you belong in one place, particularly because of the difficult history of the region where your family comes from and where I come from. So I'll be reading those 3 novels. If you're interested to join, you're very welcome. So I will see you in the next vlog. Bye!